Well, hello, and thank you for joining us for a conversation about our new book covering politics in the age of Trump. My name is Jerry Ceppos. I'm a journalism professor at LSU, and I had the pleasure of recruiting and editing the writers for this book. They are 24 of the very top political reporters in the country, which made life easy for me because they were an editor's dream. Each of them wrote an essay, and some of them were very personal about what it was like to cover Donald Trump. We, I think, collectively hope that the book helps readers climb into the heads of reporters to better understand the motivations of the media, the difficulty of fairly covering someone who didn't like us, and overall understanding the role of the journalists better. This makes our book very different from the spate of other Trump books that are coming out right now. Those books generally try to get into the minds of the former president and his advisors rather than the reporters who are covering them. We'll talk with three of the reporters who wrote for the book, and then we'll invite you to send in your questions for them using the chat function. Our conversation today is sponsored by the LSU Press, which published our book, and the Society of Professional Journalists, whose foundation supported the book financially. So with that, let me introduce our guests. Mary C. Curtis is a columnist for Roll Call, the Capitol Hill news organization. She covers the intersection of politics, culture, and race. She's the host of the CQ Roll Call podcast, Equal Time with Mary C. Curtis. A former Nieman Fellow at Harvard, she contributes to WFAE, a national public radio station in Charlotte, North Carolina. She's also a senior facilitator with the Op-Ed Project, which is trying to increase the range of voices in opinion writing. Mary has worked at the New York Times, the Charlotte Observer, the Sun in Baltimore, and the Associated Press. Major Garrett is the chief Washington correspondent for CBS News. Previously, he was the network's chief White House correspondent. And before that, he worked for National Journal, Fox News, CNN, and US News and World Report. He is the author or co-author of 4 books, including Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, The Thrills, Chills, Screams, and Occasional Blackouts of an Extraordinary Presidency. Mark Leibovich is chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. Earlier, he worked for the Washington Post. And Mark, I suppose that transparency, that popular word, requires us to confess that we worked together long ago at the San Jose Mercury News. Mark also is the author of 4 books, including Big Game, The NFL in Dangerous Times, and This Town, the story of what Mark calls the media industrial complex that is Washington. My own background is that I've been in journalism or journalism education for more than 50 years. That was a tough number to say. After working at the Rochester Democrat Chronicle and the Miami Herald, I moved to the San Jose Mercury News, where I eventually became executive editor and later was vice president for news of Knight Ridder, at the time, the second largest newspaper company in the country. Later, I became the journalism dean at the University of Nevada in Reno, and then at LSU. And as I said, I'm still a professor at LSU. Mary, let's begin with you. As you know, I didn't make specific assignments to our authors, but 3 of them, all journalists of color, decided individually on their own to write about Trump's discomfort, or what they perceived as his discomfort with journalists of color. You wrote movingly about that. May I ask you to read a few paragraphs from your essay?
Certainly. Okay. When the president trained laser-focused attacks on the press pen, colleagues who are not Black or brown were covered in a sort of camouflage as I was laid bare. Among the protesters Trump insulted, those of color seemed to come in for particularly harsh treatment, jostled and taunted And in a memorable rally in Fayetteville, North Carolina, sucker punched. It was frightening and personal. With this president, it often was personal. His words and actions affecting me, my relatives, people I love, the complex and fascinating residents of West Baltimore who taught me so much. When Trump called my hometown a, quote, disgusting rat and rodent infested mess, unquote, as a columnist, I could report it and comment on it. But then I imagined a child growing up there, as I did, waking up to Trump's tweet that no human being would want to live there. Though reporting bolsters my columns, I also get to reveal a bit of myself, facts and insights that might not have occurred to many of my readers, or at least that's what the nice ones tell me. In truth, though, everyone brings that background with them, and it can't help but be reflected in the coverage, whether or not it is tagged opinion.
Thank you. You make an important distinction in those paragraphs between opinion writing and straight news writing. But then you said at the end that all of us, whether we're straight news writers or opinion writers, bring our backgrounds to the office, or I probably shouldn't say to the office anymore, to the spare bedroom or wherever. Is that a good thing that we all bring our backgrounds with us?
I would say that it's not good or bad. It's just inevitable. I want to give you one example. So my column in Roll Call this week is on policing, particularly the officers who testified at the January 6th Select Committee hearing and their moving testimony. But it's complicated when it comes to policing because even these officers at times were battling, as they testified, folks who flashed badges and claimed to be one of them. And we know that police were among some of the people there who were the rioters. So my own history with policing as an African-American working class woman who grew up in that way is different from, and I'm gonna take a guess here, from Mark's or Major's or even yours, okay? That's just fact. Now I would say it adds depth to my reporting as well as my opinion writing. For example, when Freddie Gray happened, and that was not far from where I grew up. So I could bring a background, some reporters just parachuted in, and looked at the scene, but I could say, okay, I grew up in an area that was both underprotected and over-policed. I could see Freddie Gray not as just this Black kid who had a rough ride and was killed in the back of a police van, but as someone who, when my reporting showed, was a victim of lead poisoning growing up in a substandard house. So he kind of started out kind. And I could look into the neighborhood and see that it wasn't just a burning CVS. Across the street was a library community center where I happened to get my library card when I was 3 years old. And so I could portray that, bringing my background to it where my colleagues may not. Now, I also have an obligation, and I always have had a curiosity in seeing other people's points of view. So for instance, I have always gravitated to the people who you think I might not. I did covered the first National Tea Party convention. I think that was for the Washington Post. I was writing there, or for Politics Daily. And that was in Opryland in Tennessee. And I actually did a narrative on Confederate heritage groups that had me going all kinds of places, all kinds of times in the day and night. And I actually won a Thomas Wolfe Award for that. So I am open to listening to everyone, but I still feel that we do not have a variety, enough of a diverse variety of voices out there showing the news in different ways, not just when it comes to race, but geography, faith, and I would say socioeconomic status. Maybe it's from covering and having interviewed so much the Reverend William Barber, but I grew up working class, but I was comfortable. I never had to worry about a roof over my head or food to eat or anything like that. But we don't really talk about the poor, or we hear their voices enough from their point of view. So I just think that, as I said, it is inevitable that we're going to bring our background with us. The thing of it is, when I first got into this business, the neutrality piece was actually seeing it from a certain point of view, and it wasn't mine.
Fascinating. Thank you. Major, let me ask you a question I should have asked you before now. How many presidents have you covered?
5.
5. Okay. I asked because you wrote in the book that Trump was, quote, unlike any political figure I have covered. So that's more than just presidents, in fact.
Sure.
He's saying a lot. Tell me why you wrote that.
Because it's true, and it's not a breaking news bulletin to say Trump is unlike any political figure I've covered, or I dare say Mary or Mark or anyone living now has covered. Trump is so many things, so full of contradictions, so full of brand new, at times frightening, at times traumatic, and at times original approaches to politics. Not entirely original. Yes, we've had demagogues before. Yes, we've had people who have sort of said things just to gain attention. We've also had political figures who love to be the one who mixes up the environment themselves, always setting things in motion and watching them spring to action because of things they set in motion. But Trump does it at a higher level, a more constant level, a more energized level than anybody I've ever covered in American politics. And he changed the rules so fundamentally for Republicans. I write in my book that you were kind enough to mention, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride Near the End. And I wrote that in the summer of 2018, heading toward the midterm elections, that Republicans looking on Trump have convinced themselves that political gravity no longer exists, that Trump defies all the rules that they thought were gravitationally involved in politics, the rules that elevated you and the rules that brought you down. Trump had decimated all of those to the point that his fellow Republicans looked upon him as if he was a strange new entity, and they were terrified of him at a certain level and therefore deferred to him. Yes, they would say negative or more than negative things to reporters like me or Mark or Mary off the record, but in their public utterances, they were supportive, or they looked the other way because they lived in a state of sort of shock trauma about what Trump had done to the political order they thought they knew so well. So in that sense, Donald Trump is unlike anyone I ever covered. Looked at the rules, said they don't apply to me, and I will prove they don't apply to me every single step of the way. The other thing I would say is this. Donald Trump taught me as a political reporter something I never believed was true, which is this. His fundamental assumption about fellow political actors is they don't mean what they say. It's all phony. And if I win on my terms, they'll do whatever I say because they don't actually believe in anything. They only believe in winning, and the person who wins most and wins against the highest odds will always get them to follow him. That was his core assumption. And I would submit that he has been proven more right than wrong about that than any of us would have imagined when he came down the escalator in June of 2015.
Is any of that changing now with, he opposed the infrastructure bill and it appears to be slowly moving along?
So this is an interesting week for that very question,
Yeah.
Jerry, because he very publicly endorsed a candidate in a special election in Texas. That Republican candidate that he endorsed lost.
Right.
And that lost to someone who was supported by Rick Perry, a former cabinet member for Donald Trump, and other forces within Texas politics. That's an interesting absorbed loss for Trump, first of his kind in his post-presidency. And then he spent days railing against the infrastructure bill, and that has gone through with lots of Senate Republican support, even though he said, beware, I will get primaries against you. So this idea that he is still a potent political force may be diminishing. I wouldn't say that chapter has been fully written one way or the other, but there are parts of that that don't look as protean as they did certainly a year and a half ago or a year ago. And all you need to look at is what happened after the election up till January 20th and certainly January 6th to see how that influence affected Republicans who knew better about the 2020 election, but still played footsie with the idea that it was somehow stolen, therefore giving space and legitimacy to something we've never seen before in this country, and I hope we never see again, the assault on the Capitol January 6th.
Right. Thank you. Mark, you were one of several people who wrote your own headline for the essay, and I used it. It was, quote, the straight-talking liar. Obviously, you were referring to President Trump at the time. I wonder why you call him that, and also wonder if it relates at all, and I may be conflating two things here, to his aggressive courtship of you, and he wanted you to profile him for the New York Times Magazine. Tell us about why you chose that headline and also about your courtship.
I think one of the recurring contradictions, and as Major said, he's a man of many contradictions, but one that just kept coming up again and again is, you talk to his supporters, you see polls on why people like him, and they always say he's being straight with us. He is someone who speaks my truth. And then objectively, he lies unlike anyone else. Lies to a point where we at the New York Times and many other news organizations actually evolved to a point where we actually said lie, like many, many times. After many, many meetings that took place over my head. But the guy, look, he's a liar. He lies prodigiously. He lied to his advantage. He lied, nakedly, and yet the core, it's a basic core of his appeal was a level of candor. So, one of Trump's amazing abilities, especially during the 2016 campaign, was to not convince anyone that he was pure, but to convince everyone that, everyone is dirty, and I'm just, able to see it and manipulate it better than everyone else. And we will all benefit as a country because I can just play that game. We won't be ripped off anymore. So you mentioned my little history with Trump. I had never met the guy. I never had much desire to learn about the guy or to meet the guy. He's one of these people in public life who I kind of wrote off, candidly, as a clown. Long before he got into politics, I'm like, oh, that's kind of amusing. He's got with the hair, he's got the TV show. I didn't watch the TV show, didn't read any of his books. I knew he was around. But then, he's such a part of the scenery, right? His voice, his hair, his whole image. He's been on a million screens that I've looked at, and pictures and magazine covers. And I start getting these emails actually from Donald Trump, from the office of Donald Trump. And I was the lead political writer for the Times Magazine. I have been for a while. And the first one was, I was quoted in some, forgettable media piece, I think in Politico, like way deep down. I said, yeah, Trump is always going to get attention, something very obvious. And I don't even remember what I said. And he tears out that sheet from Politico, takes a picture of it, and has his secretary scan it. And he writes a handwritten note, magazine looks great. I will never disappoint you, Mark. And I'm like, I don't know this guy. He doesn't even, and I'm getting these letters. Then another one happened, and he said, I saw you on TV or something. And he said, it's time for a profile. The magazine looks great. And this was really strange. And it actually just coincided, by the way, with us finally, after putting it off for months, deciding that, okay, maybe this guy isn't going away. Maybe it's, September, October, whatever it was. Maybe he will remain the front runner for a while. Maybe we should pay attention to him. But yeah, I've never had a politician in 20 plus years covering politicians openly solicit. So it's time for a cover story. I don't think I've ever had a communications person or a press person be that naked about it. Trump himself, who was getting more coverage than anyone for that period, finds me and just is basically asking for it in the most, straightforward kind of way. There is a refreshingness to that. There was a refreshingness to that during the campaign. You can contrast getting access to Donald Trump during the campaign, where it was just Trump and Hope Hicks and Don Scavino, his social media guy. And, it was very easy to get in a room with him. He was talking to everyone. I could get on his plane, I'd get in his car. I was up in his, he was showing me everywhere. And so it was a very open, operation. Whereas, at the same time, Hillary Clinton is you're pulling teeth. You have to write 10 memos to 10 different people that are circulated to 50 different people at the campaign, all of which are now on WikiLeaks, and which is a whole other conversation. But no, so I guess for a journalist, it was refreshing in that there was a transparency, there was a simplicity that did sort of run against the campaign industrial complex that we all had been kind of sick of, I think, over the years. I know, speaking for myself, it can get a little tiresome.
And Jerry,
Yeah.
if I could
Jerry-
jump in real quick, but I'm sorry, Mary, forgive me just one second, because what Mark said something about talking to Trump supporters, and I covered more than 75 Trump rallies during the 2016-2015 battle for the Republican nomination and ultimately the presidency, and several when he was president. And if there was one thematic thing that Trump supporters would say when I would ask them about either misstatements, lies, grotesque factual exaggerations from Trump, they would always fall back on the same thing. Look, I don't care about that, number one. Number two, before Trump, these are their words, not mine, politicians lied to me with facts. Even if Trump gets his facts wrong, I know where he's going and I know where he's heading, and I believe he'll do that. That's good enough for me. And that was the essence of what Trump did for them. The last thing I'll say about this is I wrote this in my book. Trump had this amazing ability at his rallies to make his audience feel smarter than they did when they walked in the door. I'm not saying they were smarter. I'm just saying he made them feel smarter. Why? Because he said things they'd been saying to their wife, their uncle, their brother, either at the bar stool or in their living room for the last 15 years. And Trump said it on the biggest stage in American politics. And they're like, see, I was right all along. I feel smarter now. I feel vindicated by this guy who's talking my language. And that was one of, if not the most important part of the Trump rhetoric, which by any sort of long-standing American approach to effective rhetoric wouldn't even register, but it did for them. And it did for them in an incredibly deep and meaningful way.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that both Mark and Major said when Mark said that at first he didn't take him seriously, and that also sometimes covering him was refreshing. And then Major talking about how he made people feel. I think that I was never surprised by his success. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Barack Obama had been twice elected president, African-American man, who is interesting because though he and his wife basically were self-made and educated themselves. I know people, even people who voted for him, who had somehow messed with their idea of what America was. This African-American man was the president. It wasn't quite, it didn't hit them in the right way. And when I would cover it and I talked to so many of the people who voted for Trump, they would always say things like, he says, and then Major brought this up, what I think. He says what everybody thinks. Now, of course, to me, it's not everybody because he was saying, I would say like what? Well, what he said about immigrants, what he said about cities, what he said about people of color and Mexicans are rapists or all of those things, which was horrifying to me in a sense. I mean, it was interesting, but I always saw the dark side. And some of this was a reaction, as I said, to Obama, who was a very smart man. And I think sometimes people were, as you say, Major, they felt smart when they went to Trump rallies. And somehow Obama, he really rubbed them the wrong way, rubbed some people the wrong way. When I would go to Tea Party conventions and things like that, and they were very nice to me because they would really want to convince me that it was all about taxes and not about race or not about Obama. And then I would point out some of the rhetoric. I would point out Tom Tancredo saying, an avowed Marxist socialist is in the White House, put there by people who couldn't spell the word vote or say it in English, and people would roar. So I was not surprised by a Trump because these feelings were there. I always thought when I said they're not going to have two terms of a Black president and then put a woman in there. I mean, and I could see this pent up feeling and people did like that. I wasn't surprised. And while some people found that refreshing, it was interesting, but I always saw the dark side because I could see the effect it was having on so many people. And when I went to Tea Party conventions and things like that, people were nice because they were saying it's not about race. We were talking about you too. A lot of people at the Trump rallies wouldn't even kind of put those excuses up there because it was all about the taking the country back and back to what, And so, he wasn't to me an outlier or a clown. He was America. And as my son, who is a historian, always tells me, with progress, there is always pushback. And you've seen that throughout American history. And I think, that's what you're seeing with Trump. And now with things that are going on now with these voting laws and things like that, the whole sense of there was fraud in Philadelphia and Atlanta and Milwaukee and Detroit and Baltimore. And we all know what that means.
The more all of you talk, the more I'm reminded that some historians, especially in Louisiana where I am, but actually around the country, say that President Trump reminds them of Huey Long. And there, in fact, is a Huey Long exhibit in the old state capitol in Baton Rouge that I'd be happy to show any of you if you're down here. And there's a tape of one of Huey's stump speeches. And other than the Southern accent, it could be Donald Trump simplifying things to an incredible degree. I've never studied him, but even I understand that he promised that there would be roads in Louisiana if he were elected, because they were mostly mud piles before he was elected. And it was a simple concept for people to grasp. And he spoke to the people, and obviously was elected again and again. So just a reminder. Major, I was reminded when Mark said that President Trump tried to persuade him to interview him. You wrote some about the accessibility of President Trump, and that was it was unusual access, right?
Well, unquestionably, and this is a fact. Donald Trump was by far the most accessible president to the White House press corps of any of the presidents that I covered, because he loved it. He loved it at such almost indescribable level of egotistical adoration of what was going on. And there were several things going on. And you might ask yourself, why was it that President Trump so often engaged with reporters for such a great length of time on the South Lawn of the White House before he got on at Marine One? Some presidents have done that before. It's not uncommon, but it's usually one or two questions, maybe three or four. There were times he would go on for 40 minutes. I can remember a couple of instances when I was looking at my watch, like, get on the helicopter. I'm done. We're all done. We don't have anything left to ask you. Just go, will you? And I'd never before had that thought, even an inkling of that thought, coming any other American president. So there are two very simple reasons to explain why he loved that dynamic. One, when you're out on the South Lawn, whether the Marine One helicopter is running its rotors or not, it's a loud situation. You've really got to shout to get the president's attention. And what do? You shout one thing over and over again. What is it? Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President. And your arms are outstretched and your eyes are bulging out of your head and you're screeching at the top of your lungs. You are basically laying yourself before the emperor, screaming at the top of your lungs for his momentary attention. Let me tell you, that relates to Trump at a very deep psychological level. Then the other thing is, he hops on the helicopter, he gets a ride to Air Force One, he gets on the plane, and guess what his next hour of entertainment is? Him. Because he watches it play back on cable as he's flying to his destination. That happened every single time on Air Force One. He would watch his press conference again. He just lived it, but it was great to watch it in his own way aboard Air Force One, reminding him of all those things remind him of his centrality, his clout, his ability to define, direct, and to his own mind's way of thinking, control the conversation as president of the United States. And I write in the book about an encounter, very famous one, well remembered, in the Oval Office. After Democrats had won in the midterm elections, Nancy Pelosi is there, Chuck Schumer is there. The whole conversation is about immigration. I'm in the Oval that day, and I'm prodding everyone with as many hard questions as I can, to Pelosi, to Schumer, to the president, getting them to sort of define their differences in public. And that happens. Nancy Pelosi, the new Speaker of the House, is uncomfortable with that. Chuck Schumer's not altogether comfortable with it. Donald Trump loves it. And this thing goes on and on and on for 30 minutes. A couple of times the speaker says, no, we should take all this in private. Trump says, no, let's play it out in public. whether you like Donald Trump or not, he invited that kind of very rare, almost without precedent encounter inside the walls of the White House. Was he the spinning maestro in the center? He certainly thought himself to be that. But for the American public and anyone who's a student of government to sort of watch that play out, it was at a higher level. It wasn't always necessarily truthful. I say in the essay that many of the things that President Trump said in that conversation about immigration were false. He was corrected by Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Schumer, Minority Leader Schumer at the time, but that didn't matter. It was his way of having this moment that did not occur behind closed doors for everyone to evaluate and for his supporters to see, there's my guy fighting with the Democrats, whether it's true or not, he's fighting on my behalf. And that was the kind of moment that came again and again and again covering Trump, where access was at the highest level imaginable, higher than I'd ever encountered before. The truth level was often lower. So that's why the title of my essay is A Fire Hose in the Desert.
Yes.
He's a fire hose of access in a desert of actual information.
Right. I think you all have proven that Major's description of him as unlike any political figure that Major's covered was obviously.
He was the same guy in New York, you know,
yeah.
The tabloid Donald Trump, you know, the loving of the press, calling them up, arguing with the press. I think the first time I met him, it was in the Plaza Hotel when he owned at the time, and at an event that he had absolutely nothing to do with. But at the middle of it, he just came in to meet people and shake hands and say, yeah, I own the Plaza. I mean, that's Donald Trump.
Right. Why don't we switch and see if we have any questions from viewers? Again, you can post them under the chat logo there. Let me ask our producer, Sunny Rosen, if she has any questions from viewers.
We do have some questions. So our first question comes from Steve. I think this is for any or all of you, whoever would like to respond. What lessons have you/we learned about the profession from 4 years of Trump? In what ways has the press-presidency relationship changed?
Turn it over to any of you or all of you.
Well, I thought it's interesting. Margaret Sullivan in the Post has a really interesting piece that's getting some buzz about, you know, the way the press operates as far as trying to get all sides and be objective. When you're dealing with someone that both, as Major and Mark have talked about, will say things that's not true. And you're dealing with a party, you know, that's sort of moving the line. You know, we're talking about this select committee, and the narrative is, well, you know, Nancy Pelosi kicked off the Republicans that were on it. Will it be a legitimate one? Well, of course, the background is there was a bipartisan, nonpartisan deal that Republicans rejected. And, you know, if you look at the statement of Congressman Banks and Jordan of the things they have said, we know what the committee would be like if they were asking questions about Antifa and Black Lives Matter and all sorts of things. But the way the press is trained to report in a certain way, are we giving equal, is objective reporting actually, we're not telling the truth. And I think that I think it's something interesting to think about, the whole role of the press and how we operate. And if by trying to bend over backwards to give all sides and also fight that sort of thing about the press is liberal, if we're in fact misleading readers, viewers, listeners to what is really going on.
I would say, just in general, I mean, Trump was a very tough and is a very tough political figure to play straight. He is, you know, we are all in some ways, whether we work for a magazine or a news network or we're columnists. I mean, there's any number of different flavors of journalism and kind of voice that are allowed depending somewhat on the medium or the platform you have. And I think me as an individual, but also the New York Times as a newspaper, we evolved very much over the 5 years he's been sort of front and center in our politics as far as calling a lie, as far as actually taking real estate high up in stories to point out that, while Republicans say that this is unfair, this is a rigged commission because Nancy Pelosi just, we will spend a long time pointing out exactly what Mary just said, which is that, this is something Republicans wanted. They voted against the bipartisan commission. They voted against, everything. They did not want this. And, to actually do on one hand, on the other hand, kind of journalism in the age of Trump is basically misinforming readers because, I hate to say this, but on the one hand side that is embodied by the position that Donald Trump is taking is more likely than not incorrect in many ways or requires more context. And I think that became much more baked into our jobs over 4 years. And again, it didn't happen instantly, but I think, this is like presidencies, like politicians. The press sort of is an organic document that comes together in a very haphazard way, but you do see a fundamental difference in how I think the media covered Donald Trump in 2021 compared to how they did in 2016, 2017, and so forth. And, it's very challenging. I don't pretend that we're at the end of this conversation or at the end of this process. But at the same time, anyone who does a very straight, over here we have this, over here we have that, without actually not so much stepping in and being the referee and sort of breaking the tie here, but actually it's just sort of speaking maybe more plainly than we would have, say, 6-7 years ago as journalists, is doing our readers a disservice.
I'll make one quick observation on that question. And I think it's important to understand one of the characteristics that makes Donald Trump Donald Trump. He has a very shrewd understanding of what power is, institutionally and otherwise. He reads rooms and he reads situations based on a power structure that he intuits. Who's the powerful one in this room? Who's seeking power? Who can claim it? Who can own it? And that's true in a room, and it's true writ large. And remember, Donald Trump thought about running for president in 1996 and 2000 as the leader of the Reform Party, and he did not. And I think one of the reasons he did not is he believed and intuited that the institutional power of the Fourth Estate, meaning the American political press corps, was stronger then than it was in 2015 and 2016, when he could say, I will market my way over the heads and bulldoze my way as a marketing framed sort of concept and construct through the American media by denouncing them on one side, courting them on the other, but always placing my brand above whatever criticism they may level at me. And he did that, I think, in a timing way because he believed the institutional heft and the psychological power of the media in this country was much weaker in 2015 and 2016 than it was in 1996 or 2000. The networks were weaker, the larger newspapers were weaker, the community-based newspapers were weaker. Everyone in the media right now is in this amazing transition place that's very frightening in terms of market share, audience, and how to essentially place a price point on the profit, on the portability of news, everything in a device. We don't have printing presses anymore that we rely on. And all those underlying economics that Mark and Mary and I grew up with are shattered. And in that in-between space, there is less institutional heft, both psychologically and in the marketplace. I believe Trump knew that. And I believe his timing was to say, I can bulldoze this institutional entity in a way that I couldn't have 10 or 15 years before. And I think that's one thing you have to think about, both in his timing and his approach.
Agreed. Sonny?
Great. Excellent answers, everyone. Thank you. Our next two questions kind of go hand in hand, so I'm going to ask them together. And it's kind of asking for your opinions on what might happen next in the future. I know folks are sometimes hesitant to talk about that, but if you want to, you can respond to these. Our first question is from Sam. If it's true that Trump's personal political influence is diminishing, is that the end of the quote age of Trump, or can the lessons learned from his tactics and style be adopted without him as a figurehead? Larry also asked a similar question. Where will the Trump supporters turn for a new hero in that circumstance? So if anyone wants to speak on what might be next for this type of journalism, I will send that to you.
Well, I would jump in and just say diminished is too strong a word. Ebbing at the margins right now. It may be a beginning of something that can't be reversed, but I'm not in any position to say, oh yeah, the end of Trump is here. Whatever you think about that, think about it because it's here. There were signs this week that were, I would say, if you're in the Trump world and if you're Donald Trump yourself, you have to say, what does that really mean? And one next juncture in that is going to be how effective is he or ineffective is he going to be in trying to recruit just one single candidate against Liz Cheney in Wyoming? He's meeting them all in Bedminster. He's trying to be the kingmaker. Well, can he be the kingmaker? Because people in the Trump wing of the party may say, hey, you're important, but you're just not going to shut me out. You're not going to just deny me or nullify me. I want to run. And this is where politics gets very tricky. Ask anyone who's been in the game for a long time. Sorting these things out isn't easy, and there's no handbook. And Donald Trump is going to have to try to figure out how to do that. So I'm not saying he's diminished yet. He may be moving in that direction. On who may succeed him and how, that's all TBD. I don't know. I don't have any feel for that at all. I don't think anyone can have the personality, the energy, the ferocity that Donald Trump did. And so that may make that all the more difficult. But like Mark, unlike Mary, for much of 2015, I was surprised by the following Donald Trump created, its tenacity, its longevity, and its depth. So I'm in no position confidently to say what the future holds in a post-Trump era, if that in fact is approaching.
I guess one thing I would add is I mean, I was surprised, certainly, as I think we all were, by Trump's ability to win in 2016 and for the traction he was able to get and for the amount of times he was able to survive the near death or actual seemingly, certain death experiences that we all, proclaimed at various points. But I've been saying for years, and I think we all have, that American political consumers have had a real appetite for a new style of politician. I mean, there's a kind of sadness to the sort of soundbite, kind of lobotomized way that standard politicians talk to us and have talked to us. I mean, there's a reason John McCain in 2000 captured so many imaginations with the straight talk express. I mean, politicians are always trying to market themselves as more like a plain spoken kind of everyday guy and gal than everyone else. But, I think there was definitely a priming of the pump for someone who brought a different style to this. I just didn't in a million years think it would be something as over the top and, frankly, as offensive to so many people as Donald Trump was. So, I guess I would say that I'm going to go with the TBD answer too. But I also think that Republicans, are at their peril if they think that Donald Trump's appeal and his ability to grow the electorate, the Republican electorate, in both elections in which he was on the ballot will just seamlessly convey to the next person, I think is probably, it's not a sure thing at all. I mean, first of all, Republicans have underperformed in every election since 2016 in which Donald Trump hasn't been on the ballot. And it's been true certainly since January 6th. I mean, it's unclear to me that if Donald Trump had got 75 million votes in November, if they replayed the election on January 19th, say, after all of his, refusal to concede, after January 6th, after, what happened in Georgia, I don't think he would get that many votes. So I think that's very much an open question. One, what his appeal is going to be, going forward. It doesn't seem to be moving in the right direction, but also how much of that conveys to the party and who that person is.
Yeah, like Major and Mark, politics is so fast moving. Everybody was touting Ron DeSantis as the next Trump, and now there's been a COVID spike in Florida. I mean, you just never know what's going to happen. And look what happened with a pandemic, so things are really up in the air as far as the future. Trump's influence, we saw the race in Texas, here in North Carolina. He's jumped in for Ted Budd, the congressman, and it hasn't deterred other Republicans from jumping right in and raising more money. So, as you both said, it's not going to deter folks. At the same time, I think there is an appetite for that kind of divisiveness that is not going to be put back into the bottle, particularly that a certain group now, you see these culture war issues from transgender youth to how race is taught, being brought up, and that will be stoked, of course. And then with the way, the districts in the House anyway are gerrymandered and district, you're going to have, the Paul Gosars and the Mo Brooks are going to stay there. I mean, these folks they're probably going to be reelected. And so you are going to have more and more extreme folks in that House kind of, floating conspiracy theories and things like that. So that is definitely not going to disappear just because Trump isn't there. He is still a spiritual leader. It'll be really interesting to see how a lot of the independent voters go, because even folks, who are leaning Republican, they might be looking at, photos of the videos from January 6th and hearing some Republicans not even bothering to listen to them. That might appeal to the base. But what is it going to appeal to as far as the swing voters are concerned? So I think we'll have to see what's going to happen. I also agree that Trump has a power or charisma, if you want to call it that, that won't be easily replicated.
Great, thank you. Just for our audience, Major had to run to cover a current presidential discussion, so that's why he disappeared from the call there. Our next question is somewhat related to current events. With the Olympics happening this week, we've seen an increased focus on the importance of protecting and supporting the mental health of folks in high achieving roles. Can any or all of you talk a bit about the way that this kind of shake-up, negative, hurtful communication that journalists were experiencing during this presidency might impact their mental health? And if you are interested in discussing how might you or other journalists protect or care for their own mental health in that nonstop, high-pressure world of national journalism, especially when facing adversarial folks that you're covering?
I guess I'll go first. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, look, it was a very taxing bunch of years, mental health wise, for a lot of reasons. For certainly people in the media. I mean, I think, for one, I assume this is true of most journalists, but we have armed security guards in our office now. We didn't have them a few years ago. And I think it's got to be somewhat related to Donald Trump calling us the enemy of the people and so forth. I mean, the Trump rallies I went to didn't feel safe always. A lot of my colleagues, especially those on the Hill who were there on January 6th, who, none of us have become strangers to the kinds of death threats that you hear about. I mean, it's just gotten a lot uglier. So that's, it has taken a toll. Absolutely. I mean, I think what's interesting though is, I remember I was talking to someone a few days ago when Simone Biles dropped out, and there was a lot of talk about her mental health and so forth. This colleague of mine said, I'm just really glad Trump doesn't have a Twitter feed right now, because you just know that he would weigh in a way that would not be, the sensitive way of looking at it. Let's just say it would probably, I don't think he would err on the side of the compassionate take on this necessarily. And what is stunning to me is just someone, expressing a kind of vulnerability, in a very heroic kind of way, in someone who has achieved such incredible, unmatched and greatness in her field. To have something like this, and you just know that there is going to be a segment of the population, probably on social media, who is going to say the absolute least graceful thing. And those voices out there have, I think, been empowered by, frankly, I think having someone who will always sort of take a position that seems like the opposite of what we're used to, whether it's graciously accepting defeat in a presidential election or graciously accepting the explanation of an incredible woman who is a gymnast who, is doing this incredibly difficult thing and going through an incredibly sort of, visible, experience that no one in a million years could identify with, unless you're Simone Biles. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying, I think we all have experienced vulnerability in ways that we hadn't before, both as journalists, but also in appreciating the toll that this line of work in public life, whether you're an athlete, whether you're a politician, whether you're a journalist, is going to take on you. And I would hope that, as human beings, that we would actually have a fuller sense of what the other person is going through.
Yeah. I would add, I think, support everything that Mark has said. I realized this year of COVID and the restrictions of that, how off balance it put me, because doing this work, I do depend on balance, which includes, of course, home life, family, and I wasn't able to see a lot of them out of town. Also, I do other work. I do lots of things, but I do some work with arts groups, and that's arts is sort of an antidote for me. And of course, that was shut down. So it is sort of what happens, and then what COVID added to it. And I will have to say, you do get pushback, and being an African-American woman, some of the insults I would get, or emails or tweets or things like that, would be racialized, and also it would be sexist as well. And it can be quite disturbing. And, if it gets too disturbing, I will report it. But also, we have taken precautions as well. And so I think it is good to have that balance. And I try to work on self-care things, from yoga to whatever, because it can get very stressful, and you want to be able to do your job. Everybody in this book, they try to be excellent. They try to do the best job they can. And to do that, they have to take care of themselves. But I thank you for asking that question, because sometimes people don't. And some of the work I do is public facing, not as much as Major. But, I shared with Jerry a comment, even when I was going to the gym, trying to get away from it. There was a situation where people verbally attacked me, and one gentleman actually started following me. And, I took care of it, but I was a bit shaken by it. So, I don't complain about it, because I choose to do this. I love doing this. I'm a news junkie forever, and I wouldn't do anything else. And the fact that launching this podcast in the midst of COVID, adding on work was great. This week I talked with, Malcolm Graham, who lost his sister 6 years ago, shot by Dylan Roof in Charleston, and talking about a new documentary on the Confederate flag, and talking to Representative Clyburn about voting rights. This is stuff I feel very lucky to do. So the other stuff is just things we have to take care of. But I appreciate the question, because what is Simone Biles, to bring up the analogy, tweeted today, something like, I've been loving the outpouring, because I realize people care for me more than just my gymnastic abilities and accomplishments. And I always doubted that. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. So thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for the answers. So we could keep chatting all day, but I think we're getting close to the end of the hour. So I think we can go ahead and sign off.
Good. Well, thanks to Major, Mark, and Mary, first for their wonderful chapters in the book, and second for giving the book a human face today. I hope all of our listeners have enjoyed it. I'll make a very unsubtle reminder that if you did, feel free to buy the book at thank you, Mary, at either Amazon or lsupress.org. And with that, we love talking to you, and thank you for tuning in. And with that, goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.